and welcome to Ye Old Bestsellers Book Club, where I am reading through some of America's earliest best-selling novels, as reported by The Bookman, a literary magazine of the 1890s. Today's book is The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope, published in 1894. Zenda is the work that Hope was known for. It was very popular in its time, the most successful, I think, of all the books I've covered so far. This book had enough cultural impact that the made-up kingdom that much of the story takes place in, Ruritania, became a stand-in name people use even up to modern day when talking about some hypothetical, unspecified foreign country. Ruritania comes up in legal textbooks as a stand-in name. Ruritanian romance became a genre term to discuss books taking place in made-up European kingdoms. While Zenda was his greatest success, Hope's career as a writer did continue for decades after. Now, this is the first time I'm actually going to recommend that if old-timey adventure novels appeal to you, I would say maybe read this one before or instead of listening to me talk about it. It's not a masterpiece of literature, but it's a pretty fun, breezy read. I had a good time, and it'd be best read if you don't know what's going to happen, which I am about to start spoiling. But if you don't care, it begins, quote, "I wonder when in the world you're going to do anything, Rudolph," said my brother's wife. "My dear Rose," I answered, laying down my egg spoon, "why in the world should I do anything?" End quote. Rudolf Rassendyll is a pretty well-off gentleman of late 19th century English society who does nothing but, as he puts it, knock about. And his sister-in-law regularly, quote, "objects to my doing nothing and having red hair," said I in an injured tone, end quote. Her problem with the hair goes all the way back to a countess in the mid-1700s, an ancestor of Rudolph's, who almost certainly knocked nasties with the red-haired, sharp-nosed prince of the foreign kingdom of Ruritania, and ever since then his hair and nose pop up about once in a generation. Quote, "It will be observed that my sister-in-law, with a want of logic that must have been peculiar to herself, since we are no longer allowed to lay it to the charge of her sex, treated my complexion almost as an offense for which I was responsible," end quote. Whoa, dude, that became not allowed in the 1890s? Someone should tell the internet. There's actually a coronation happening in Ruritania soon for a different guy named Rudolph, a legitimate descendant of that prince, who was actually also named Rudolph. That's 3 of them. And our Rudolph, perpetually bored and with nothing important to do, decides he wants to go see this coronation and this country, which as a rule his family has avoided, given their scandalous history. He stops in Paris on the way to meet up with some friends, one of whom dramatically flings himself on the sofa, moaning about how he's in love, infernally in love, with Antoinette de Mauban, who herself is said to be in love with a Duke Michael, who is the half-brother of the King Rudolph about to be crowned in Ruritania. Duke Michael, in turn, is in love with a princess, who is also his cousin, but he is competing for her with his royal half-brother, also her cousin, so a semi-incestuous love pentagon? Antoinette ends up on the same train that Rudolph is taking into Ruritania, but the two don't speak. He disembarks in the town of Zenda, 50 miles outside the country's capital of Strelsau, which is where the coronation will be taking place, but it's busy there, all the hotels are booked, so he's lodging here in Zenda. And on a stroll through the woods outside of town, he happens to bump into the king, who is staying in a hunting lodge of his brother Michael's nearby before the coronation tomorrow. Quote, "As I looked on him, I uttered an astonished cry, and he, seeing me, drew back in sudden wonder. Saving the hair on my face, and also that he lacked perhaps half an inch of my height, the king of Ruritania might have been Rudolf Rassendyll, and I, Rudolph the king," end quote. There are more little differences the longer he looks. Our Rudolph apparently has more firm, close-shutting lips, whatever that means. Feels like an insult to the king, but they are otherwise pretty identical. There are 2 men with the king, an older, short, stout, soldierly-looking man, and a more slender, dignified younger gentleman, who introduce themselves as Colonel Sapt and Fritz von Tarlenheim. Rudolf introduces himself as a Rassendyll, and the three men have heard of the scandalous family story, so the king happily declares Rudolf a cousin and invites him to dinner. They all chat, they eat, they drink, and drink, and drink, and when the king declares he has drunk enough, he is brought one more flagon of wine. A gift from his brother, to be given when the king had become, quote, weary of all other wines, end quote. He drains the flagon, then passes out for the night with our Rudolf not far behind him. Our Rudolf wakes up the next morning. The king does not. He, quote, lay full length on the floor. His face was red as his hair, and he breathed heavily. I knelt down and felt his pulse. It was alarmingly languid and slow. Was it drugged, that last bottle? I asked in a whisper, end quote. Sapt and Fritz aren't sure, but maybe. Probably. Either way, he's not waking up in time for his coronation. And he can't just call in sick. People are going to know what that means. He's called ill, wink wink, before. The people aren't going to be happy that the king can't pull it together long enough to not be too drunk for his own crowning. A chunk of the population already thinks Michael should be king instead, and given the chance, Michael could take advantage. Sapt says, quote, as God's alive, man, the throne is lost if the king show himself not in Strelsau today. I know Black Michael. For a moment or two we were all silent. Then Sapt, knitting his bushy grey brows, took his pipe from his mouth and said to me, as a man grows old, he believes in fate. Fate sent you here. Fate sends you now to Strelsau, end quote. Rudolf protests that that would be a terrible, impossible idea. He may look like the king, but surely it's too much of a risk to literally impersonate him. But with some convincing, he does agree. He'll go handle the coronation, and then late tonight they can swap back. In the meantime, they hide the king in the wine cellar of this hunting lodge. However, they may have been overheard in their scheming by an elderly woman, the mother of one of Michael's staff. So Sapt ties her up and throws her in a different cellar. Then off they go, leaving the king's servant Joseph, who they do trust, in charge of his majesty. Sapt, quote, began at once to instruct me most minutely in the history of my past life, of my family, of my tastes, pursuits, weaknesses, friends, companions, and servants, end quote, all the way into the capital. And he'll be standing by the whole time to whisper hints in Rudolph's ear when he needs it. Sapt is honestly startlingly calm about the whole thing, while Fritz, on the other hand, is on the verge of a panic attack the entire way into Strelsau. The banter and relationship between these three, the way that they interact, is one of the highlights of the book for me, and also one of those things that's hard to share without just reading whole scenes that aren't really relevant, but it's there, I promise, it's charming, they're funny. The deception goes remarkably well. Quote, no one betrayed the least suspicion, and I felt my nerve returning and the agitated beating of my heart subsiding, end quote. However, while he's talking to someone, quote, the marshal bit his white mustache, end quote. This happens 4 total times throughout the book, his teeth working on an end of his grizzled mustache. Sapt bit his mustache, biting his mustache again. Is this a thing? A common thing? Enough that 2 characters should be doing it more than once in one book? I mean, this might surprise you, but I have yet to grow a mustache. Are you supposed to chew on them? I cannot think of a way to make that look even mildly dignified. Anyway, Rudolf finally comes face to face with the king's dear brother, Michael. Quote, and when he saw me, his red cheeks went pale all in a moment, and his helmet fell with a clatter on the floor. Till that moment, I believe he had not realized that the king was, in very truth, come to Strelsau, end quote. So, confirmation of foul play. Michael clearly expected the king to be incapacitated. But they play nice. Rudolf gives him a brotherly kiss on the cheek. It's here that he is introduced to the Princess Flavia, who I am going to try very, very hard not to call Princess Coffee Machine. She's the princess from our love pentagon earlier, a lovely young redhead who is the cousin of both Michael and the king, who both also want to marry her. It's fine, they're royalty. Rudolf is perfectly happy to flirt on the king's behalf pretty aggressively the entire time he and Flavia are together. So I guess now our Pentagon has a weird additional growth dangling off of it. I don't think it's a hexagon if 3 of the points are attached to Flavia. It's a pentagon with a tail. That night, the trio begins phase 2 of their plan, Operation Swap Back. Fritz is going to stay here, making sure no one comes into the king's chambers, while Sapt and Rudolf sneak out of the city and ride hard for Zenda. When they get to the hunting lodge, they find the bindings that had been restraining that old woman now on the ground, torn and slashed and rent. Inside looks about how they left it, and empty, except for all the mess. Quote, "Then we came opposite the door of the wine cellar. 'Come, it's all right,' said I. A loud oath from Sapt rang out. His face turned pale, and he pointed again at the floor. From under the door, a red stain had spread over the floor of the passage and dried there. Sapt sank against the opposite wall. I tried the door. It was locked." End quote. Sapt has a drink, while Rudolf breaks the door down. Quote, "The red stain, turning more and more to a dull brown, stretched inside. I walked 2 yards into the cellar and held the candle high above my head. I saw the full bins of wine, I saw spiders crawling on the walls, I saw, too, a couple of empty bottles lying on the floor. And then, away in the corner, I saw the body of a man lying flat on his back with his arms stretched wide and a crimson gash across his throat. I walked to him and knelt down beside him and commended to God the soul of a faithful man, for it was the body of Joseph, the little servant, slain in guarding the king." End quote. And once again, they can't go get help for the king, because, quote, "Do you think that the people will enjoy being fooled, as you have fooled them? Do you think they'll love a king who was too drunk to be crowned, and sent a servant to personate him?" End quote. This is the version of events that Michael will tell, and the people might crown him for it. But, quote, "If you play the man, you may save the king yet. Go back and keep his throne warm for him. But the Duke knows, the villains he has employed know. Aye, but they can't speak. We've got 'em. How can they denounce you without denouncing themselves? This is not the king because we've kidnapped the king and murdered his servant. Can they say that?" End quote. Rudolf considers. Quote, "Sapt, suppose they have killed the king. Then, by heaven, you're as good an Elfberg as Black Michael, and you shall reign in Ruritania." It was a wild plan, wilder even and hopeless than the trick we had already carried through, but I was a young man, and I loved action, and I was offered such a hand in such a game as perhaps never man played yet. End quote. So he agrees. Thus begins their extended farce. Rudolf does pretty well, besides some etiquette faux pas and social blunders. The most unbelievable part of this impersonation for me isn't how he looks or even what he knows, it's his voice and his accent. Because English is not the native language of Ruritania. I'm pretty sure it's German, which Rudolf does say he speaks German as readily as English. But just because he's very fluent does not mean he should be able to flawlessly mimic the accent of a native speaker of a country that isn't even Germany. Who knows what sort of regional accent they have? And I don't really care, but this is a made-up country. They didn't have to speak another language in the first place. This problem is author-created, and I don't think fully excused. Rudolf thinks it's the sheer audacity of the scheme that in part protects him, because who would be ballsy enough to do something like this? It's not something people would even consider as a potential problem, so they just assume, yeah, he's been kind of weird lately, but he's the king. Now, it gets pretty much confirmed that Michael is imprisoning the king alive in a castle of his near that hunting lodge. It's the Castle of Zenda. And we know this because Michael has a group of very special boys, known as the Six, his 6 most trusted, most dangerous men. 3 are here in the capital with Michael, that makes sense, but the other 3 are known to be stationed at the castle, like they might be guarding something. So, presumably, Michael is planning to keep the king as leverage, I guess, while trying to have Rudolf the Pretender killed. Then he can dispose of the real king and marry Flavia, who is actually supposed to be the next in line. Remember, Michael's a half-brother, there's a whole thing. Basically, marrying Flavia would solidify Michael's rule from all angles. And here is where Antoinette comes back. She's the one in love with Michael, and he is stringing her along, at least enough that he can use her. He forces her to try to lure Rudolf into a trap, but if Michael's plan succeeds, he'll marry Flavia. And Antoinette doesn't want that, so she starts helping Rudolf to sabotage Michael. She does disapprove of his whole scheme and thinks he's being a terrible person, but it's not enough for her to lose interest. Rudolf blames this on her being a woman. He himself has been under a lot of pressure to secure a marriage with Princess Flavia. She is well beloved by the people, it would be a good political move, and the two of them have been really getting on lately, but it puts him in an awkward position. Quote, "I was playing the most delicate move in all my difficult game. I had to keep the princess devoted to me, and yet indifferent to me. I had to show affection for her and not feel it. I had to make love for another, and that to a girl who was the most beautiful I had ever seen." End quote. Friendly reminder that to make love used to mean to flirt with or woo. One night at a ball, he and Flavia end up in a side room having a private conversation. They're very fluttery and flustered. It's a lot. And they kiss and admit that they love each other, and Flavia says that she only started to love him recently. The crown must have changed him. Rudolf, of course, realizes this means that she loves him in a way that she never loved the actual king, and is on the verge of admitting to her his secret before he is saved from himself by Sapt, who may have been listening at the window to this entire conversation, that poor man. After this, Rudolf starts really feeling the temptation that he could just leave the king to die, take the crown, and keep Flavia for himself. But he doesn't want to succumb to that, so they need to deal with all of this as soon as possible before his resolve slips. He says to Sapt, quote, "Let us go to Zenda and crush this Michael and bring the king back to his own again," end quote. And knowing that this means Rudolf selflessly giving up on his love, Sapt puts a hand on his shoulder and huskily whispers into his ear that he's just the best of all the royal family. And then Rudolf takes him by the hand and they're both tearing up. And boys, can you calm down? Their cover story for going back to Zenda is a hunting expedition, and someone in Fritz's family is lending them a chateau on the opposite side of town from Michael's castle for them and all their men to stay in. Flavia is not happy. Quote, "You said last night that every hour away from me was wasted, but a very big bore. That's a different thing," end quote. Then she actually starts full-on crying because, quote, "This is like what you used to be," end quote. I feel like this is a little bit excessive, Madam Coffeemaker. Rudolf admits that he's not actually going boar hunting, but rather Michael hunting, which helps. Flavia doesn't know what all is actually going on, but she doesn't like Michael. Then they have a tearful goodbye. She promises to rule Ruritania if he dies horribly, though her heart be broken. As Rudolf is getting settled in the chateau for some hunting, Michael is stationing himself at the castle, recovering from scarlet fever, heavy air quotes, and so the standoff begins. First, he and Michael just poke at each other, sending messengers, pretending to be civil, their men occasionally scuffling in the woods at night. One of the men who comes by for a chat a couple times is one of Michael's 6, Rupert Hentzau. He's young, 23 at most, handsome, cocky, taking none of this seriously. Rudolf almost likes him just a little bit, because if you're going to be a villain, at least be a charming one. Quote, "It makes your sin no worse, as I conceive, to do it a la mode and stylishly," end quote. One day, he comes with an offer from Michael, 1,000,000 crowns if Rudolf just quietly walks away, which he refuses, and they stand around trading insults. Rupert says, quote, "Indeed, you are a man after my own heart." "Saving my poor honesty," said I, "maybe I am. But that I keep faith with men and honor with women, maybe I am, my lord." "Is your mother dead?" said I. "Aye, she's dead. She may thank God," end quote. Ouch, Rudolf! Quote, "I had touched him in the raw, for all the world knew he had broken his mother's heart and flaunted his mistresses in her house," end quote. Yikes, Rudolf! There's more back and forth. Rupert hits him back with a jab about Flavia. Then he makes a very clever but risky play to sneak a stab at Rudolph's shoulder, then takes off. Quote, "I sank into my chair, bleeding profusely, as I watched the devil's brat disappearing down the long avenue. My friends surrounded me, and then I fainted." End quote. The devil's brat is my new official title, and how I want to be referred to exclusively henceforth. Also, Rudolph is fine. Don't worry about it. While he's unconscious, his men kidnap one of Michael's staff, a man named Johann, and they offer him promises of safety and rewards aplenty if he helps them out. Johann also has a feeling that if Michael wins, he's not going to want a lot of people out there who know how his success came to be, the 6 excluded, so Johann is probably in danger. So he describes for them what exactly is going on at the castle of Zenda. The castle itself is surrounded by a moat on all sides. A drawbridge connects it to a more modern chateau on the outer side of the moat, and this chateau is where Michael generally lives. In the castle, just past the drawbridge, there's a pair of rooms, an outer room leading to an inner room with a single window, and this is where the king is kept, guarded by 3 of the 6 at all times. Should the castle fall under attack, the 3 are to defend the outer door as long as they can. But should they start to become overpowered, one of them is to go into the inner room and kill the king. Quote, "While the 2 hold the outer room, the one who has killed the king unlocks the bars in the square window. The window now gives no light, for its mouth is choked by a great pipe of earthenware, and this pipe passes into the moat. The king being dead, his murderer swiftly ties a weight to the body, inserts the feet in the pipe, and pushes the body down. Silently, without splash or sound, it falls into the water, and thence to the bottom of the moat, which is 20 feet deep thereabouts." End quote. There's a lot of little variations to the plan, what to do if the attacking forces are completely overwhelming versus maybe small enough to be defeated, etc. All angles are pretty much covered. Quote, "Whether I went in peace or in war, openly or secretly, the king would be dead before I could come near him. At the worst, Michael would stand where he had stood before I crossed his path, with but one man between him and the throne." End quote. Michael and Antoinette, who is also at the castle, have rooms opposite each other on either side of the hall, just past the drawbridge on the chateau side, and Johann sleeps near the entrance of the chateau with the servants, who are armed, but only with pikes, and we learn who all has what keys to what doors and all that. Also, this part doesn't matter, I just can't figure it out. Johann says that the king has, quote, "his arms confined in fine steel chains, which did not allow him to move his elbow more than 3 inches from his shoulder." Now, the only way I think I can get my elbow 3 inches from my shoulder is if I cross my arms right under my chin in just the dumbest looking way possible, and this is still more than 3 inches. That cannot be what this means. For now, Johann is sent back to Michael. The situation continues to escalate. Rudolph leads a recon mission sneaking around the castle that ends in 2 of the 6 and some of Rudolph's men being killed, and Rudolph is pressured by his advisors to agree to an official betrothal date with Flavia 2 weeks from now. Also, she's here with them at the chateau now, despite being ordered not to come. She heard he was wounded and got worried. And they've heard through Johann that the king is starting to become very ill as a result of his imprisonment. He is wasting away. Quote, "And, persuaded by the physician, they had allowed Madame de Maubon to visit the king and give him such attendance as his state needed, and as only a woman can give." End quote. You have a whole-ass physician! What is he good for, if not caretaking? It's not like he has other patients. I don't think Michael would let a man who has seen the kidnapped king leave the castle. Whatever. By day, Rudolph and Michael still pretend to be civil. Quote, "For our one point of union was that we could neither of us afford to throw our cards on the table." End quote. One day, Rudolph bumps into the head of the Strelsau police, who is investigating the disappearance of an English gentleman by the name of Rudolf Rassendyll, who no one has heard from in like 2 months. And you didn't think of this, my boy? I get you've been busy, but maybe you should have sent a postcard to your brother or something so people don't think you're dead. He is actually given a convenient out here, because he, as himself, was last seen in Zenda, having travelled on a train with Antoinette de Maubon, and some people have assumed he may have been following her. And there have been rumours that an unknown person is being held captive at the castle of Zenda. So Rudolf suggests that, hey, Michael and Antoinette kind of have a thing, and the Duke doesn't like rivals. Maybe this Mr. Rassendyll was a little too close on Antoinette's heels. He promises to investigate some himself. It's a delicate situation, you understand, and shoos the policeman back to Strelsau for now. And then he finally commits to making a real attack on the castle. The plan is this. Tomorrow, at exactly 2 a.m, Johann will unlock and open the front door of the chateau. Sapt and a group of men will be waiting outside to rush in. Rudolf also gives Johann a letter to pass on to Antoinette, instructing her to scream at the same exact time. Quote, again and again she was to cry, "Help, help, Michael, help!" and then to utter the name of young Rupert Hentzau. Then, as we hoped, Michael would rush out of his apartments opposite and fall alive into the hands of Sapt. End quote. Rudolf, meanwhile, will be lurking down in the moat with a ladder, hoping that Rupert will come from the castle to investigate and Rudolf can ambush him at the drawbridge. Then it's just a mad rush to get to the king, hoping he hasn't been killed. Rupert is one of 2 people who has keys to the king's cell, so he can take those, that'll help. It's the best they can do. There are also backup plans and variations for what if Johann doesn't open the door, or what if we don't come back, etc. Whatever happens, Rudolf is committed that this will be the end. If he's not dead, quote, and if the king is not alive and on his throne before the day of betrothal comes, I will tell the truth, come what may, end quote. So everyone gets into position, under the cover of night. Rudolf waits in the water of the moat, his back to the wall of the castle, watching the windows of Michael and Antoinette's rooms in the chateau opposite him. And he starts getting worried about his plan, because, quote, women are careless, forgetful creatures. I prayed that she might not forget that she was to be the victim of a brutal attempt at 2 o'clock precisely, end quote. Dude, she's been sending you letters pleading that you get her out of this mess. She is surrounded by cutthroats, one of whom, Rupert, you know has been making unwanted advances on her, and she's a forced accomplice to regicide. You don't think maybe she'll be invested enough to pay attention to the clock? He actually sees her through the window into Michael's room, and then Rupert, who pretty aggressively tries to come on to her, despite her saying she would rather throw herself in the moat. It gets as far as a forced kiss until the 2 are interrupted by Michael, which, what did you expect? Why are you doing this in his room? Michael and Rupert have been butting heads a lot recently. We've heard that through Johann, often over Antoinette, and because Rupert's an asshole. Michael sends both of them to their respective rooms, and the drawbridge is pulled back, separating the castle from the chateau. But Rupert sneaks back out of the castle, using a set of secret handholds that take him down into the moat and then back up on the other side. Rudolf takes advantage to climb up and hide by the castle doorway. Not long after, Antoinette starts screaming from her room for Michael to help. Rupert is doing literally what they were going to frame him for, just like 20 minutes early, which is a real coinky-dink. Quote, I cannot tell the thing so quickly as it happened, for all seemed to come at once. There was an angry cry from Madame's room, the cry of a wounded man. The window was flung open. Young Rupert stood there, sword in hand, end quote. Johann is involved somehow. Rudolf can only really hear what's going on, but it sounds like fighting. Then Michael faintly calls for help, and Rupert hurls himself laughing into the moat. One of the other 6 comes out near where Rudolf is hidden, and, quote, I struck at him with all the strength God had given me, and he fell dead in the doorway without a word or a groan. I dropped on my knees by him. Where were the keys? I found myself muttering, the keys, man, the keys, as though he had been yet alive and could listen. And when I could not find them, God forgive me, I believe I struck a dead man's face, end quote. He does find them, and unlocks the first door of the king's 2-room prison, where he finds the only 2 of Michael's 6 that are still in the castle. Quote, I rushed madly at the Belgian. He was no swordsman, though he fought bravely, and in a moment he lay on the floor before me. I turned. Dechard was not there. Faithful to his orders, he had not risked a fight with me, but had rushed straight to the door of the king's room. And surely he would have killed the king, and perhaps me also, had it not been for one devoted man. For when I forced the door, the sight I saw was this. The king stood in the corner of the room. Broken by his sickness, he could do nothing, laughing horribly in half-mad delirium. Dechard and the doctor were together in the middle of the room, and the doctor had flung himself on the murderer, end quote. Dechard kills the doctor, but it bought the king time, and now he and Rudolf start to duel. Quote, I believe that the man would have mastered me and slain me, and then done his butcher's work, but even as he pressed me hard, the half-mad, wasted, wan creature in the corner leaped high in lunatic mirth, shrieking, It's Cousin Rudolf! Cousin Rudolf! I'll help you, Cousin Rudolf! And catching up a chair in his hands, he came towards us, end quote. Rudolf has to coax the king like a dog to, come on, boy, come join in the fun. This fight's getting weird. The king does help a little bit. He's kind of distracting. He does get wounded, but then Dechard slips in the pool of blood from the dead doctor, and that gives Rudolf an opening to kill him. Outside, he hears the drawbridge being put into place and pauses just long enough to bind a wound and find a gun before going to listen at the door, hoping it's sapped and his men finally arriving. Instead, he hears, quote, an easy, scornful, merry laugh, the laugh of young Rupert Hentzau, end quote. Sapped is now half an hour overdue, which means Johann must never have opened the front door, and if that happened, the plan was for Rudolf to meet up with them outside, and if he never showed, they were supposed to assume he and the king were dead and leave to rally more forces, which means Rudolf is alone. Quote, for a moment, I sank unnerved against the door. Then I started up, alert again, for Rupert cried scornfully, Well, the bridge is there, come over it. Michael, come and fight for her. If it were a three-cornered fight, I might yet bear my part. I turned the key in the door and looked out, end quote. Rupert is standing in the middle of the bridge, sword in hand, casual as ever, in a standoff with a group of servants wielding pikes on the chateau side of the bridge, clearly very afraid of him. Rudolf could shoot him here and now, he nearly does, but he's too fascinated, wondering how this violent rivalry with Michael will come to an end. But Michael doesn't respond. Instead, quote, the answer to his taunts came in the wild cry of a woman. He's dead! My God, he's dead! End quote. Shortly after, quote, a woman staggered onto the bridge. Antoinette de Mauban was in a loose white robe, her dark hair streamed over her shoulders, her face was ghastly pale, and her eyes gleamed wildly in the light of the torches. In her shaking hand she held a revolver, and as she tottered forward she fired it at Rupert Hentzau. The ball missed him and struck the woodwork over my head, end quote. Rupert laughs and jeers, Antoinette pauses, collects herself, and much more deliberately raises her arm again. Quote, before she had got her aim, he bowed in his most graceful fashion, cried, I can't kill where I've kissed, and before she or I could stop him, lightly leaped into the moat, end quote. At the same time, Sapt arrives with his men. He and Fritz decided that they couldn't just abandon Rudolf, so they came back late and spent 15 minutes breaking down the door. Now, knowing that the situation at the castle will be handled, the wounded king will be tended to, Rudolf hurls himself into the water after Rupert. The chase takes them through the moat, up a rope, and into the forest. Rudolf is wounded and weary and gasping for breath, while Rupert just will not stop turning over his shoulder to smile and wave mockingly. He comes to a girl, who he pulls screaming off her horse. Quote, he treated her gently, laughed, kissed her, and gave her money. Then he jumped on the horse, sitting sideways like a woman, and then he waited for me, end quote. They have a little chat. Honestly, Rupert is fun. Terrible man, fun villain. I like their dialogue here. Rudolf eventually gets frustrated with him and cries, quote, get off your horse and fight like a man. Before a lady, said he, pointing to the girl. Fie, your majesty, end quote. Rudolf rushes him in a blind rage. They start to fight. Someone's definitely gonna die, until Fritz von Tarlenheim tears in on a horse, revolver in hand. Rupert, quote, flung his leg over the saddle, but yet for just a moment he waited. Leaning forward, he tossed his hair off his forehead and smiled, and said, Au revoir, Rudolf Rassendyll. Then, with his cheeks streaming blood but his lips laughing, he bowed to me and bowed to the farm girl, and he waved his hand to Fritz, who let fly a shot at him. The ball came nigh doing its work, for it struck the sword he held, and he dropped the sword with an oath, wringing his fingers, and rode away at a gallop, singing as he went, end quote. He's just so much. It's kinda great. I want to watch this performed by extremely committed actors. Rudolf wants Fritz to go after him, quote, but Fritz stopped his horse and leaped down and ran to me and knelt, putting his arm about me. And indeed it was time, for the wound that Dechard had given me was broken forth afresh, and my blood was staining the ground, end quote. Rudolf tries to take the horse himself, but collapses to the ground. It's all very dramatic. Fritz kneels over him and gives him a little kiss on the forehead, wipes his mouth with a handkerchief, and, quote, "Thanks to the most gallant gentleman that lives," he said softly, "the king is alive." I strove to cry, "Huzzah!" but I could not speak, and I laid my head back in Fritz's arms and closed my eyes. And then, lest Fritz should do me wrong in his thoughts, I opened my eyes and tried to say "Hurrah!" again, but I could not. And being very tired, I huddled myself close up to Fritz to get the warmth of him and shut my eyes again and went to sleep, and, quote, "Rudolph's fine, he just needs a nap," in Fritz's lap, I guess. What is medical attention compared to the warm thighs of a friend? Meanwhile, Flavia hears that the king has been injured, and so she leaves their base across town to come see him. She is arriving just as Rudolf has recovered enough to walk with Fritz's help, and they bump into each other by accident. She's very confused. She heard the king was at the castle. Surely he can't be in two places at once. Zapp shows up, too, and at least convinces her to come away from her entourage for some privacy. Quote, "I sat in a sad heap on the ground and buried my face in my hands. I could not look at her," end quote. She kisses him, quote, then Zapp spoke in a low, hoarse whisper, "Don't kiss him, he's not the king," end quote. Fritz sobs over the tragedy of doomed love. Flavia is frantic. Rudolf admits it's true, he's a false king. Everyone is very emotional, and I think Flavia passes out. But now the switch can finally be reversed. They spin a tale that the king stormed Zenda to free an imprisoned friend. Michael was killed in the scuffle, and the king was wounded and is ill and recovering. His madness was apparently a prison exclusive and disappears immediately upon his release, because when Rudolf is brought to speak to him, he is very coherent, if weak and bedridden. He says he wants to keep Rudolf with him, to tell everyone of his good deed, to keep him as a dear friend, quote, "But they tell me I must not, and that the secret must be kept, if kept it can be," end quote. Rudolf agrees it's for the best. And then the king tells him that, quote, "You have shown me how to play the king," end quote, that he will strive to rule as Rudolf ruled, that no one may know the difference, because Rudolf is such a special, special boy. Quote, "His eyelids closed, I kissed the king's hand and let Fritz lead me away. I have never seen the king since," end quote. Then a farewell to the Princess Flavia, who now knows the whole story. She assures Rudolf that she always loved him, the real him, never the king. Quote, "Then I was false to all that I should have been held by, for I caught her in my arms and prayed her to come with me, daring all Ruritania to take her from me. And for a while she listened with wondering, dazzled eyes, but as her eyes looked on me I grew ashamed, and my voice died away in broken murmurs and stammerings, and at last I was silent," end quote. They both are for a while. Then, quote, "Is love the only thing?" she asked in low, sweet tones. "If love were the only thing, I could follow you in rags, if need be, to world's end. But is love the only thing? I know people write and talk as if it were. Perhaps to some, fate lets it be. But if love had been the only thing, you would have let the king die in his cell. Honor binds a woman too, Rudolf. My honor lies in being true to my country and my house. Your ring will always be on my finger, your heart in my heart, but you must go, and I must stay," end quote. And so they part with a kiss. Zapp and Fritz ride with him to the train station, quote, "They promised to send me all news, they overwhelmed me with kindness," end quote. And just before he boards the train, one last time they bare their heads to him as if he were a king. And then Rudolf Rassendyll is carried away, a mere English gentleman once more. He finally sends a postcard to his brother, confirming he is, in fact, still alive. He passes through Paris, and we hear that Antoinette is back in France, now living a life of solitude. Eventually, he makes his way home again. His sister-in-law had pestered him to go do something productive on his travels for once in his good-for-nothing life. He'd promised to try to write a book about a foreign culture. Quote, "It turned out that I had done not what Rose had wished, but the next best thing, what she had prophesied. She had declared that I should make no notes, record no observations, gather no materials. When I returned empty-handed, Rose was so occupied in triumphing over Burlston, his brother, that she let me down quite easily," end quote. They discuss the coronation in Ruritania, and Rudolph's brother shows him a picture from a newspaper in which the king is suspiciously reminiscent of our dear Rudolph. More like Rudolf, in fact, than an earlier picture of the king, says his brother. Quote, and whether he suspects anything, I do not know. If he has, he keeps it to himself, and he and I never refer to it. Since all these events, whose history I have set down, happened, I have lived a very quiet life. The ordinary ambitions and aims of men in my position seem to me dull and unattractive. End quote. One day, maybe, he'll mix again in great affairs. He hopes so, and he wonders often what became of Rupert Hentzau, who does have a sequel novel. Once a year, he spends a week with Fritz, who always passes on a rose from Flavia. She's married now to the other Rudolf, living in service of her country. Quote, shall I see her face again? Of that I know nothing. In this world, perhaps, nay, it is likely never. And can it be that somewhere, in a manner whereof our flesh-bound minds have no apprehension, she and I will be together again? That I know not. But if it be never, I will live as becomes the man whom she loves, and for the other side I must pray a dreamless sleep. The end. I like that ending paragraph. Now, The Prisoner of Zenda came out just before the Bookman magazine actually got started, which is usually where I would try to pull reviews from, but I couldn't find one because it wasn't running yet. The Sewanee Review, however, was, and Zenda got a mention in the November issue from 1894, where the book is described as, quote, pure and unadulterated old-time fiction, free from introspection or evolution or science or religion or socialism or environment or politics or theology, with never a reform in sight. The story is full of delightful murders and hairbreadth escapes and charming villains, with here and there a fair lady and a love scene. Beginning in the Park Lane of today, in half a dozen little pages we are landed in the Middle Ages, and only now and then are we shocked back to the 19th century by the mention of a railway train. But as a rule, the characters tear about on horseback and swim in moats and clatter over drawbridges and draw swords and daggers. But through all this blood-on-the-moon activity there steals a silver shaft of light, a tender gleam of love, and the pathos of it lingers long after we have closed the book. Sarah Barnwell Elliott. This does seem to be the shared sentiment wherever I found this book mentioned, that it was light and fun and kind of depthless. It was very praised, but sometimes criticized as not the most meaningful work this author could be capable of. It is one of my favorite things about reading reviews from the time these books were published in, when the reviewer and I come away with very similar thoughts about some things. I also kept forgetting this was supposed to be happening in the 19th century because it was so swords and horses. I also appreciated its shallow, easy fun. And it probably shouldn't be surprising, but having that shared experience of the same story across a bridge of 129 years is neat. On the theme of shared experiences, the reviewer Sarah Elliott recommended Zenda's breezy adventure for, quote, these strenuous days when nerves are strained like fiddle strings and played upon momently by all the modern inventions for annihilating time and space, when the only hope of peace from world fairs and expositions and telephones and electric cars and all the other crazing machines and life absorbance is a voyage in a sailing vessel or a journey across the desert on a camel, end quote. Life is exhaustingly busy, so if you're tired of your phone but you don't have a camel, relax with some simple, easy, fun reading. My personal thoughts on this book: it might be the most enjoyable read for me so far on the podcast. It was definitely the easiest. The language is very simple and relatively unimpressive. There were better written books, but that simplicity also helped it age in a way that makes it much more approachable than some others and a lot less work, and it was the most fun. Unfortunately, it also had a lot less bizarre content to lovingly make fun of, or derisively, depending on the book. I'm looking at you, Frank Gordon. I worry this is one of the hardest to capture the charm of in a retelling, especially with how much I enjoyed some of the dialogue, but I didn't want to just act out a lot of entire scenes that didn't really impact the plot. Also, this author loved him some parentheses. My God, there are 66 sets of parentheses in this 22-chapter novel. There are 9 in the first chapter alone. It was actually distracting. Mostly they're for little comments from Rudolf, quote, the younger gentleman, parentheses, he reminded me of Osric in Hamlet, end parentheses, bowed himself out again. End quote. And, in that case, I think it worked. It felt very conversational. The comment wouldn't really fit in commas, but they weren't all that justified. I think, though, that's about it. So I hope I'll catch you in the next one. And in the meantime, you can catch me at Yobbpod, YOBBPOD, on all those social media places, mostly. And for today's life advice from the past, don't fall in love with your cousin, even if he's really just a guy pretending to be your cousin who's maybe, like, also distantly your cousin, but he's literally identical to your actual cousin for some reason. Love polygons shouldn't grow on family trees. That's all I'm saying.